February 5th, 2018. Welcome to members of the public and staff. First order of business is to approve our agenda for this afternoon's meeting. Is there a motion?
So moved.
Second.
It's been moved and seconded. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed? Thank you. The agenda is adopted. Next is our minutes, adopting our minutes for January 16th meeting. Is there a motion?
So moved.
Second.
It's been moved and seconded. Is there discussion or edits, comments? Hearing none. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed? Thank you. Our January 16th minutes are also adopted. We have two business items, members. The first is 2018-31. Baytown Township is our first community to submit their 2040 comprehensive plan. Congratulations.
Bonus.
And Corinne Wendell is here to present.
Yes, thank
Welcome
you.
to the committee.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Mr. Chair and council members. My name is Corinne Wendell. I'm the Senior Planner and Sector Representative for Districts 11 and 12, and so I'll be presenting the item for Baytown Township this afternoon. And so the township's located in District 12. So it's in the eastern portion of Washington County, as you can see on the map, and on the shore of the St. Croix River. The township's bounded by the city of Oak Park Heights to the north, the city of Bayport and St. Croix River to the east, also West Lakeland Township to the south, and the city of Lake Elmo to the west. So Thrive designates the township as both rural residential and as diversified rural, as seen in Figure 2 in the staff report and also here on the map. The lighter green in the center, or maybe it's darker on the screen, the darker screen or the darker green in the middle is that diversified rural, and the rest is rural residential. And so in terms of regional systems, the map shows the regional systems, as you can see, with the exception of Manning Avenue to the western border of the community, there's no significant regional systems within the boundaries. And so the community is not part of the regional park system, does not have any principal arterials, and then also is not served by wastewater services. And so as seen in the forecasted growth here for the township, it is a rural community, and so the council forecasts the limited growth in terms of population and households and employment over the next coming decades. And so the plan that they submitted is reflective of that. So then we get to the 2040 future land use map that they have here. And so the elements of this map are very similar to their 2030 future land use map in terms of the the land use categories, as well as the described densities are very similar in both maps. And so the development patterns in the central portion of the community have been consistent throughout this past decade. And so as described earlier in slide 2, Thrive does designate this both as rural residential and as diversified rural. However, the plan proposes that the small area in the central portion of the community that is diversified rural be amended to be rural residential. And so therefore the entire community would then be rural residential. And so the township has developed the plan to be consistent with the rural residential designation and the policies for that community designation. So then in addition, in coordination with the township and the council does not have plans to provide wastewater services for the community within the 2040 planning period. And the community is not within the long-term wastewater service area, and then also has no plant capacity expansions are planned for this area as well. And so we have our proposed findings for this plan. And so with the review, it conforms to the system plans, is consistent with council policies for the proposed community designation, modification for residential, and is compatible with the plans of the adjacent communities and affected jurisdictions. And so as shown on page 1 of your staff report, and then here as well, we have the proposed actions. So to authorize the township to place its plan into effect, to revise the community designation from both of those designations just to rural residential for the entire community, and then also to advise the township to implement the advisory comments in terms of the review record for parks and transportation and surface water management and housing. And so page 2 of the staff report also states the standardized advisory comments referring to the next steps and statutory requirements that each community would follow in order to adopt their final plan. And so this language on page 2 will be seen in all of the comprehensive plan update staff reports that you'll see going forward. And then also, I did contact Baytown Township. They have a planning commission and a town board meeting this evening, so they did not have a representative to come. But I informed them that I would let them know the outcome of this meeting. And so I thank you, and please let me know if you have any questions.
Thank you very much. Other questions? Councilmember Elkins.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The only question I have is are the soils in the area suitable for more or less permanent septic system sewage treatment?
Oh, good question. Yes, Lisa will come and help with that.
I'm Lisa Barajas, Manager of Local Planning Assistance. Mr. Chair, Councilmember Elkins, the soils in this area are pretty suitable from what I recall. I'm not an engineer, but recalling from the last planning cycle when I reviewed this plan also, it is loamy soil. Unlike Anoka County, which is very wet with wetlands, this area actually has quite a bit of drainage available to them.
Good. Okay.
Other questions?
No.
Okay.
Mr. Chair, I'll move the approval of this
Okay.
item.
It's been a motion.
Second.
It's been seconded. Is there a discussion to the motion? Hearing none, all those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed? Okay, the motion carries. Thank you very much.
We need a "that was easy" button.
Yeah.
Members, our second item of business is relating to our 2018 committee work plan. Just following up on our discussion in our January session. What you have before you is consistent with what we discussed at that time. There haven't been substantial changes since our last meeting, and I would entertain a motion to move forward with our work plan.
So moved.
Second, provided that we receive a Gantt chart.
Councilmember Chavez, it should be the Chavez chart. Rename it.
That's my fault. I'm sorry. I'll get you one.
I'll bill it for it.
So we'll be sure to distribute that among the committee members. Is there any just other discussion to the motion? Hearing none, all those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed? Okay, thank you. The work plan is adopted for the year. That concludes our business items for the afternoon. We have 3 information items. The first is a look at trends and comprehensive plan amendments since 2010. Welcome back, Lisa.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Mr. Chair. It's my pleasure to present this for you today. As an update, you may recall for members when we met last year at the Minneapolis Park and Recreation Board, I had presented trends from 2010 to 2016. This includes an additional year. So just as a reminder of how data and policy relate, we've been presenting between Libby and myself and some of our other research staff a number of different reports to you over the last year, ag preserves, land use inventory, building permits, etc. And today we will focus on those amendments, as you can see, as part of that broader comprehensive planning context. So today, specifically, I'll talk about the 2010 to 2017 period. So in all cases, unless I state otherwise, I'm talking about the full period of these 8 years. And then I'll talk about the different categories of amendments and how they're distributed among them. Whoops, I got a little ahead of myself there. Project-specific housing amendments and how amendments impact and affect housing in the region. And then that distribution amongst community designation. So just as a grounding, we have a lot of, we actually have 7 different categories of amendments, which didn't all show up. Here we go. First being system statement amendments. These occurred right after the 2030, or the updates to the 2030 TPP and 2030 Regional Parks Policy Plan that we had done in 2009, so as part of the last cycle. Right now, those 2 plans are the 2040 versions of those plans are being updated, and in a year or so, we'll issue future system statements for impacted communities just for those 2 plans. Text amendments are those that are changes to the text that usually involve definition around allowable uses within a land use category, changes to affected jurisdiction, for example, changes in a watershed district's boundaries, or other similar boundary changes. Small area plans are, like it says, any addition to a small area plan, station area plan, downtown master planning, or other similar effort. Oftentimes, when communities do those efforts, they then amend them into their plan, either as an appendix or otherwise. Switches, which we'll dig into more a little bit further, is a change in the land use guiding from one type of use, like a residential use, to an entirely different type, like a non-residential use altogether, or vice versa. Down guide and up guide together are just changes in allowable density, so it's always a residential use to another residential use in both of those cases. And then infrastructure changes. These are usually very specific to the system itself. So whether it's a change in local trail network, a change in water supply plan, a change in a wastewater infrastructure plan, they're very specific to that. So we do get those from time to time. And as you'll see, there are not that many of those. So overall, for the entire study period, you can see that we have an uneven distribution of amendment types. Over the course of the last 8 years, 108 of the 188 communities amended their comprehensive plans. That resulted in 547 plan amendments, and 74 of those amendments were in 2017. I will also note on this slide and on many of the future slides that some some amendments fall into multiple categories, so you shouldn't add these up. It will not add up to 547. Many amendments include multiple changes in order for something to move forward. So, for example, an adoption of a small area plan might also include an upguiding in some of the land use designation after they had undergone that process. So as you can see, switches were by far the largest category type, and I'll dig into those a little bit deeper going forward. So over the years, you can see the total number of amendments that we've done each year and that distribution amongst categories. You can see in red that blip of system statement amendments. They only impacted a small number of communities. They were just changes, that interim update to those two plans, transportation and parks, that only impacted a handful of communities in the region. And we issued those statements in 2011. Most of communities responded in 2012, with just a handful in 2013. One item I'd like to note on here as well is that you see switches are pretty common throughout that gray portion of the bar. I will also note that you'll see a larger share of downguide amendments earlier in the decade, especially in 2011. This is part of that coming out of the recession that we were seeing, that market starting to pick up, but really for that kind of estate style kind of housing. But over time, we've seen that total amount go down, and we've seen a growth in the number of upguide amendments over the years, or the lower green portion, the darker green portion of that bar. Text amendments are pretty common throughout and don't have any particular pattern associated with them. Just as a little bit of grounding, our community designation map, which I'm sure you all have imprinted into your memories by this point. But as we move forward, I'll refer to each of these designations and how amendments are distributed among them. So you can see that our suburban communities really lead the pack in amending their plans, taking a large proportion of the total number of amendments over the years. Out of 547, having a good about a third, I can't do the math in my head, about a third of the amendments overall over the course of the last 8 years. Emerging Suburban Edge follow close behind them as well with 130 amendments. We kind of surmise that the reasoning for this is that these two community types are really kind of transitioning. In emerging suburban edge communities, going from more rural greenfield style development into an urbanized style development with wastewater services and water services. So a lot of kind of churn in there and figuring out where development should go, where it should be, and how it relates to their local community vision. In suburban communities, in many of these communities, we see them switching from that greenfield style development into a more redevelopment focus. So we see some of that turn there as well, and some of that switching from as you'll see in the future slides, a switching of should this be residential, should this be commercial, or vice versa, as their development patterns are maturing and changing as that community's grown. And as we would expect, rural residential and agricultural have the fewest number of amendments. They're pretty static over the years and have a standard development pattern that applies to the entire community nearly. So over the course of the last 8 years, amendments that had projects, very specific projects associated with those amendments that are development driven, resulted in nearly 19,000 housing units. Based on the data from the period from 2010 to 2016, and the number of housing units, that was about 1 in 4 of the regional total housing units constructed were supported from a comprehensive plan amendment. But over the 2010 to 2017 decade or study period, we also found that housing units resulting from amendments, of those nearly 19,000, over 2,000 of those were specifically for affordable units. And nearly 3,000 of those total units were for senior restricted housing, where it was identified. Excuse me. Of the affordable units that resulted from plan amendments, we found that more than half of these units were restricted to senior units. We thought that was an interesting fact to point out, that they weren't more broadly open, that the types of projects that result or that get brought forward that are for affordable housing that need an amendment more often than not were senior units. And I don't know if it's because of the locations that they were supported, or if it's because that's an easier product type to bring forward through an amendment process. It could be a number of factors that influence that. But I did want to point that out because it was such a large proportion of those affordable units.
Mr.
And then
Chair,
you can
Yes, Councilmember Dorfman.
so if my math's right, then of those 2,000 plus affordable units, only 728 are affordable to families other than seniors.
Mr. Chair, Councilmember, yes, from the units that were supported by plan amendments, that is correct.
Yeah.
I will note too that there obviously are more units, affordable housing
Sure.
units that are produced in the region.
Sure.
But certainly the ones that are coming through and needing that additional local approval through an amendment process, that is true. Oops, this is a very touchy keyboard. I apologize. Just click. Stop going. I don't know why it's going. I just want to make a point about this last one. Okay, there we go. So this is how you can see all of the units that were supported by plan amendments and their distribution through the region amongst the community designation. And as one would expect, suburban communities have the most number of amendments. They have the most amount of housing that results from their amendments as well, project-specific amendments. One interesting fact to note is that suburban edge communities had about the same number of amendments as urban center communities. They weren't leaders in the pack, they were kind of on the lower end, but their amendments supported nearly 5 times or more than 5 times as many housing units as urban center communities did. This is likely due to the geographic scale of the amendments that are brought forward. Suburban edge communities are usually bringing forward larger acreages that are affected by their amendments, whereas urban center communities usually have much smaller acreages associated with their amendments as well. But just kind of keeping in mind that kind of digging into the details on the differences between the number of amendments isn't as meaningful as the number of units or the amount of acreage that's impacted. One other note that I would like to make was related to Councilmember Dorfman's comment regarding affordable housing. Do know that from the 2010 to 2016 time period, that's the period we have affordable housing production numbers available for. We don't have 2017 yet, but we did find that about half of the affordable units that were built across the region in all urban, suburban, and emerging suburban edge communities resulted from a plan amendment. So just something to keep in mind there. They weren't our necessarily always the largest production, but most or a good portion of those affordable housing units in those three community designations were the result from a plan amendment. Once we have updated 2017 affordable housing numbers, then we'll update our map here too and see how that comes out. I would probably like to not see that trend continue, like to make that affordable housing production a little easier, not require an additional amendment step. This is a very touchy keyboard. I apologize, it keeps skipping through. So next I'll talk about switch amendments, which were our largest category. And I've broken it down into 4 categories within switches. And just as a reminder, switches change land use guiding from something that they weren't at all. So not residential, um, to something else, or in the case of public, not public. So it could have been residential, it could have been non-residential like industrial or commercial, and was re-guided to a public use like a park or some sort of institutional type use. In the second category, among non-residential, are guiding changes between commercial, industrial, office, or other similar non-residential use. The third one of 2 residential is from anything that didn't previously allow housing and changing it to something that could allow for some sort of housing use. And then to non-residential is from a category that did allow for housing and switched it out and didn't change it to public. It would fall into this category. So we find, as you can see on here, that the residential accounted for the nearly half of the total amendments within this category, within this kind of larger grouping. And at about 20% of the amendments were changes between non-residential uses. In 2017, we saw this overall trend continue. This is pretty similar overall. So we had 40 amendments in 2017 that were switches, and more than half of those were to a residential use, and then 8 to non-residential and 6 among non-residential. We didn't have any public ones in 2017. So you can see the impact of acreage is here too, and as one would expect, the public ones really outnumber this. And we saw these earlier in the decade. This switched to public. This was for additions to some of our state parks, some local park guiding, some institutional changes, but these were large acreages that were coming through for these switches to public. So while they were a small number of amendments, they were the largest acreage that we found. Among non-residential is less common, that switch to commercial to industrial, office to something, or mixed business highway or some other similar non-residential use does occur, but it is a much smaller acreage where that occurs in that. The amount of acreage impacted between 2 residential and 2 non-residential is pretty close to in acreage amounts. Stop jumping. And then, as one would expect, the suburban designation again leads the pack, with emerging suburban edge behind it. As I had spoke about earlier, that churning and what fits and what works as those communities are kind of switching from a different type of development pattern to a newer development pattern for them, we see a lot of that change. You can see in the suburban category that not only do they lead the pack overall in this type of guiding switch, but they have the most number in every category, not just in one particular category. So a lot of different changes that are happening within suburban communities. And then everyone else seems to be kind of right around the same level, and obviously no changes in rural residential or agricultural. I'm really sorry about how apparently I have a lead finger on this and keeps jumping ahead of me. So the total housing resulting from switch amendments is also quite significant. Of the 18,700 units that resulted from all plan amendments, more than half of them were from these types of switches. So it wasn't an up guiding or a down guiding that was project specific, but actually providing for residential uses on land that previously wasn't planned for a residential use. So that light blue area are units specifically from a switch amendment. And then from top to bottom, affordable units that result from plan amendments typically are, as you can see on the chart, are from switches. They're not from an an upzoning of any sort or an upguiding of any sort, but really planning for affordable units where there hadn't been any residential use previously planned. We've seen some amendments over the years that have been things like an old commercial old golf course. I think we had a little mini golf that was switched over to an affordable housing complex. They hadn't planned for housing to be there. They thought it would always be a commercial use, for example. Market rate, we see at about half of those units overall. And for senior housing, much like affordable, those are often happening when it comes through as an amendment or happening on land that was not previously guided for residential use.
Chair,
Councilmember Elkins.
quick question, Lisa. So are you seeing a lot of things like, old shopping centers or old light industrial being, converted to housing if it's near like a commercial node?
Mr. Chair, Councilmember Elkins, we're basically seeing that just about anywhere. Usually it has some sort of access associated with it on either a local thoroughfare or some sort of road. It's not always necessarily in a town center or some local node, but oftentimes is in an area that has pretty good accessibility, given the designation that it's within.
Thank you.
Next, I'll jump into the down guide and up guide, and this is the last section that I'll go through because this is the largest one that I thought you would be interested in. So by community designation, you can see we actually have, over the study period, nearly the identical number of up guide amendments as we have down guide amendments. There's actually only 2 amendments difference between them, with up guide just winning, edging out down guides. But you can see that distribution is a little bit different. In urban center and urban areas, they do more up guides than down guides. In suburban edge, and emerging suburban edge, it goes back and forth. And from year to year, it changes even amongst those designations, depending on whatever is happening within that community. You should also note that especially in suburban edge and emerging suburban edge communities, one particular amendment might actually have might have a land swap of sorts. So they have a higher density area and a lower density, let's say high and the medium next to each other. And because it was in concept or comprehensive plan, there's no parcels associated with it. It might be a 40 acre or 120 acres in some cases. That when they do have a development proposal come forward and they like the concept, then they will amend their plan to fit the concept. And that usually involves kind of moving the pieces around. So they might fall into both a high and a low. So there's a lot of swapping that's happening within these. It's not necessarily a net loss or a net gain in many of these amendments. But overall, we see that up guide, while there's only 2 more CPAs overall, up guide CPAs affect more acreage, and that's I think it was about a 20%. No, I'm going to say it wrong, so I won't say it at all. It's about a 700 acre difference there. And then resulting units is also a bit larger as well, so that we see about 18% more units overall out of up guide amendments than we do from down guide amendments. So in closing, we know that the most common amendment type is that switching. We see that far and away more than anything else in the types of amendments that we're reviewing. Suburban and emerging suburban edge communities also amend their plans the most. And if our regional trends continue, between 1 and 4 and 1 and 5 housing units in the region are resulting from plan amendments. We also find that up-guiding amendments are affecting more acreage than down-guiding amendments. And then about roughly half of that affordable housing, total affordable housing that's occurring in urban, suburban, and emerging suburban edge communities is resulting from a plan amendment. So thank you. Certainly if you have any other questions, I'm happy to answer them or happy to investigate further if you'd like.
Great, Lisa, thank you very much. I think that's really interesting background. I have a couple questions. I'm interested in one of the early slides you showed demonstrated what I suspect is the impact of earlier iterations or revisions to the transportation policy plan. And yet, after the most recent update, it didn't seem like there was a similar set of revisions or amendments that were submitted around that. Could you just talk a little bit about why there's a difference or why you suspect there might be a difference?
Sure, Mr. Chair, are you referring to the system statement amendments?
Yes.
Um, Thank you. System statement amendments. So um, we issue at the council two types of system statements. One is our decennial system statement that we issued in 2015 that results in comprehensive plan updates. The second type of system statement is whenever we make an interim change or revision to one of our policy plans. So as you know, we do that for the transportation policy plan on that 4-year basis, give or take, and for regional parks on that same kind of cycle. We last updated those interim plans, I believe it was in 2010. We issued the system statements in 2011 related to those. And that's why we just saw that little blip there. The next amendments that we had done to the plan, I believe would have been transportation policy plan, I think did not result in a large reason to do it. They were maybe more internal. So we did not issue system statements again until we had done the decennial update, and then we did that full round. So it's the council's responsibility to determine when they need to issue a system statement, and we've often done that when we want to ensure that communities are aware that we've made changes and that they're reflected in local plans. So it may be that previous smaller amendments to the TPP were already reflected in local plans or maybe had been driven by that process. And so we didn't feel the need to then tell them that, hey, we updated this because you told us to do it.
Okay, thank you. Other comments or questions? I have one other question, and I don't mean to put you on the spot, but I wonder if there were elements of this set of findings that you found surprising or in conflict with your expectations or our shared expectations.
Mr. Chair, I think just the amount of project-specific housing out of the regional totals was the part that I was, I think, not as in tune to. I see every amendment that comes through. So I see them as they're going on, but how it related to the regional picture was something that maybe was less certain for me. So when I was looking at those more specifically, and especially that distribution amongst community designation, that was pretty enlightening for me to see how much of an impact amendments were having, especially more recently. I didn't expect it as much because it feels like compared to the last decade, in the 2000s when we had a pretty hot housing market. When I first started working at the council more than 10 years ago, we were processing several hundred amendments a year. So it felt like, yep, housing, that's the big thing. And because we're, around 70, 80 a year now, it doesn't feel like it's as big of an impact, but to see how large of a proportion still of the housing regionally still is supported by a plan amendment was a bit of a surprise.
Mm-hmm. Great. Last chance. Any other questions? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Our next item of information is Matt Schroeder is going to present on areas of concentrated poverty in the region. Welcome, Matt.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and council members. I am Matt Schroeder here from Regional Policy and Research to give you an update on what the newly released American Community Survey data tell us about ACPs in our region. We did publish a short Metro Stats today on our website on this issue. So I want to acknowledge the author of that, Kristen Rabaturis. Basically, areas of concentrated poverty, or ACPs, are census tracts where 40% or more of residents are in poverty. And the definition of poverty we use for this, according to the Choice, Place, and Opportunity report from 2014, is having an income below 185% of the federal poverty threshold. So for a family of four in 2016, that was having an income under $45,442, which is about a little higher, but about as much as what HUD defines as 50% of the median family income. So just a similarity there between this measure and an important measure of very low income households that we use in housing policy and a lot of programs in community development. We also recognize a subset of these, which are ACPs where at least half the residents are people of color. These are related to what HUD calls racially and ethnically concentrated areas of poverty. We've opted for a slightly different term because we want to emphasize not the concentration of different races or ethnicities, different races or ethnicities in itself, but the disproportionate exposure of people of color to concentrated poverty. And that's something that we care about because concentrated poverty is a big part of the place-based dimension of disparities that we committed to analyze in Thrive MSP 2040. So there's a lot of research out there showing that growing up or even just living in a high poverty neighborhood constrains people's life chances. So education, employment, income, health, crime victimization, on a lot of indicators, people in high poverty neighborhoods just don't do as well, regardless of their own individual or family income, as people in higher income neighborhoods. We also recognize that there's a risk of disinvestment by the public and private sectors, and that if this continues, it can affect communities' tax bases so that it can affect everyone in a city, not just the people who live in those lower income neighborhoods. So for all these reasons, we want to look at areas of concentrated poverty and say what we can about them and call attention to the exposure to them. To start off with a bit of poverty context, I'll note that the people in poverty in the region, it's helpful to think about who these people are, whose concentration we're looking at. And looking at people whose income is less than 185% of the poverty threshold, these are basically the working poor. So 4/5 of them have a high school diploma. 2/3 of them have worked in the past year, so that even though they seem to have trouble finding the sort of full-time year-round stable employment that can give them a source of stable income, they do work, and on that basis, most of their income comes from wages, salaries, or self-employment. It's earned income. So only a small slice is from public assistance. So when we're talking about areas of concentrated poverty, these are not necessarily areas with the jobless poor or the truly destitute. These are areas with a lot of the working poor, people who just can't seem to get ahead in this economy. Looking at the region's poverty rate, what share of people are below 185% of poverty, you can see that it was about 16% in 2000, rose pretty steadily throughout the Great Recession, and over the past few years has declined to about 19% in 2016, the most recent ACS data. So probably not a surprise, but I did want to make a big point about this, which is that when we're looking at tract level data, which we have to use to analyze neighborhoods, we're really looking at 5-year blocks of data. In this case, the 2006 to 2010 period, which incorporated some years before the Great Recession. And then this most recent 5-year ACS data set, we're looking at the 2012 to 2016 period. So that when we're combining these different years of data and averaging them out, we do see that the poverty rate for this most recent ACS data set is a bit higher than it was in that 2006 to 2010 data set. So I just wanted to mention that as context for the growth of ACPs, which we'll look at right now. So where are the ACPs? As we've highlighted past years, they've grown pretty rapidly since 2000. In 2000, there were 61 census tracts that qualified as ACPs, only one of which was outside Minneapolis or St. Paul. And in this most recent data year of 2012 to 2016, there were 102 of them, 18 of which were outside Minneapolis and St. Paul. So, but either within the central cities or outside of them, ACPs have been growing. And the map just shows that. So this is the set of ACP tracts in 2000. in 2006 to 2010, and this most recent year, the 2012 to 2016 data. So some changes there that I'll get to in a second. But first, I did want to show the set of ACP 50 tracts in this year, the set of tracts of ACP tracts where half or more of the residents are people of color. So mostly in the central cities, but also in the suburbs, Brooklyn Center, Brooklyn Park, we've seen before, New Hope as well, Richfield, Bloomington, but also Columbia Heights and Eagan, which I believe this year have new ACP 50 tracts that have not had them before. When we're kind of abstracting from maps to think about concentrated poverty in general in across the whole region, it's helpful to look at the share of the region's residents in poverty who live in ACPs, and that's what these blue columns show, from about 22% in 2000 all the way up to a high of 31.3% in the 2010 to 2014 data. And it's declined in this most recent data set to 29.8%, which is good news. It's following the regional poverty trend that as we continue to come out of the Great Recession, and as more and more people share in the recovery, concentrated poverty also declines. But a big lesson from this analysis is that that's not true for ACP 50s. So ACPs where majority of the residents are people of color, we haven't seen that same decline in concentrated poverty. So that the share of the region's residents in poverty who live in those tracts has hovered around 25% for a lot of the past 5-year data sets. So just looking at this sequential moving 5-year average, we don't see that same decline in ACP 50s. And I'll talk about some of these dynamics in a bit, but did want to highlight that for now. But looking at how ACPs are changing or persisting, I'll focus first on a couple of tracts where we have seen some changes over the past decade or so. So this is a tract in Columbia Heights, in the southern portion of Columbia Heights, spanning Central Avenue, that's experienced a sharp increase in poverty from about a quarter of the population in the 2006 to 2010 data to nearly half the population in 2012 to 2016. So this is a tract that, on the basis of the available data, looks like it's getting younger, more racially and ethnically diverse, and more likely to rent rather than own. And so what seems to be happening, again, on the basis of the available data, is that older white householders who are empty nesters are starting to sell their homes or rent them, which opens up opportunities for people who happen to be lower income or younger people or people of color to move in. So that this tract, as I mentioned before, has now become an ACP 50. And then looking in Minneapolis, there's a tract south of Powderhorn Park between Chicago and Bloomington Avenues that's had a decline in the poverty rate over the past decade or so, from 46% in 2006 to 2010 to closer to 30% in 2012 to 2016. So this tract has kind of gone the opposite way, from being an ACP before to not being an ACP now. And along the way, we've seen increasing home values and rents, and a suggestion from the ACS data of an increasingly white population. So just kind of highlighting the differing dynamics that can result in changes within tracts.
Matt, can I ask a question about that? Can you talk a little bit more about your use of the word suggestion there? Why does it suggest that to you instead of indicate that?
Certainly, Mr. Chair. When describing the racial composition of tracts with ACS data, I tend to be on the cautious side. That's because it's as distinct from the 2010 census, which tried to count everyone. The ACS is based on a sample, and on the basis of who they get in that sample, they weight those numbers up to make them represent higher levels of geography. But when looking within tracts, we tend to pay attention more to the percentages of people of color rather than the absolute numbers. So when and that percentage has increased, but because of the sample-based nature of the ACS and um, and not wanting to make it seem to have the same certainty as 2010 census data does, for example, we tend to kind of back off on the certainty with which we say that.
Thank you.
Apart from these individual tracts, though, these are really kind of some of the only tracts that we can really point to some fairly clear or fairly suggestive changes. Really, I think the big lesson from the most recent data is the persistence of ACPs, some ACPs at least over time. So this map shows the number of ACS data sets between the 2007 to 2011 data and the latest 2012 to 2016 data that in which a tract has gone up above that 40% threshold that we use to define ACPs. So the lighter blue colors here show tracts that have a relatively high poverty rate, but that depending on the sample, who's sampled in any given year, may be above the 40% threshold, may be below it, but that don't seem to really have that same persistent nature of concentrated poverty as the darker blue tracts do. And I wanted to note here especially the overlap between those darkest blue tracts, which have been ACPs in all of the data sets that we've examined, and the current set of ACP 50 tracts. So again, getting to the lesson that in ACPs with mostly people of color, concentrated poverty seems to be most persistent. And when we've looked at that before, I mean, as we talked about in the Choice, Place, and Opportunity report, this has long, persistent roots as well. And here's one way of looking at that. This is a digitized map of the 1934 Homeowners Loan Corporation neighborhood appraisal map. So neighborhood appraisers went through every neighborhood and rated them for the risk of default on loans. And so they rated neighborhoods from green, the best, quote unquote, neighborhoods, least risk, through the blue areas, still desirable, to the yellow, definitely declining, and finally the red areas, hazardous areas that carried the most risk, hence the term redlining. And a lot of people have noted the racial dynamics here, that when you look at how appraisers described neighborhoods and the basis for their rating of the relative risk level, they paid a lot of attention to the racial composition of neighborhoods and the racial composition of surrounding neighborhoods as well. So when you look at the yellow and red areas in particular, it was both very hard to get approved for a loan here, and these neighborhoods also tended to have higher proportions of people of color, or be near areas at least with high proportions of people of color. And so this was a really influential map taken up by private lenders, by the Federal Housing Administration, by the Veterans Administration, so that especially in the after World War II, as construction started to pick up, this really influenced where lending happened. And so when you look at where today's ACP 50s are, there's a lot of overlap between the red and yellow zones and today's ACP 50s. And also, as well, when you broaden that to include all ACPs, not just those that are majority people of color today, that there's a lot of overlap, that each ACP tends to have a red or yellow area at its core. And so when you kind of add up all the acreage within here, here's what we see, that within today's ACP 50 tracts, about 58% of the acres, the total acres in today's ACP 50 tracts, fell within the red and yellow zones, less than 10% in the blue or green zones, and then the rest, the 32% there in the gray, the non-residential uses, including parks and water and commercial, industrial, and so on. And then looking at the set of tracts that today are not ACPs, less than 20% in the red or yellow zones, I think 35% in the blue or green. So again, overlap between the risk assessment decisions made 75 years ago, or actually close to 85 years ago, and and what we see today now in concentrated poverty, specifically the exposure of people of color to concentrated poverty. So again, this is more in the sense of why we care about highlighting concentrated poverty, not because we want to stigmatize any specific area as undesirable or anything like that, but because we want to call attention to the factors that created them, to the extent that those factors limit housing choice and cut off people from opportunity. And so, in that light, here are some things that the council has been looking at to make sure that we can all try to figure out how to turn around that past history, both within the council and outside the council. So, from the perspective of transportation investments, I know that we've been prioritizing arterial BRT routes in areas of concentrated poverty, and especially the Better Bus Stops program, which tried to look at which bus stops were ripe for improvements, focusing on areas of concentrated poverty. The Livable Communities Act program also looks at where they're funding units from the perspective of expanding housing choice within and outside of ACPs. And then the Metro HRA's Community Choice Program finds people living in ACPs who are interested in moving to higher income areas and providing them with the tools and services to be successful in that move. So most generally, I know that our communications and engagement team has been looking for several years at how we can increase our leverage with other stakeholders to promote residential of choice and expand opportunity for everyone. So just a few slices of ways that the council is looking at this based on Thrive MSP 2040 and subsequent actions. So those are some ways that we've been trying to do that. Summing up again, a bit of a mixed bag that we do continue to emerge from the Great Recession as more people share in their recovery. But again, especially relative to 2000, concentrated poverty is still up and doesn't show many signs of receding, especially in areas where majority of residents are people of color. With that, I will sum up. The MetroStats is available on our website, and I'm happy to answer questions now or through email later, whatever you prefer. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Matt. Council members, comments or questions? Councilmember Munt.
Mr. Chair, Matt, we've heard that poverty is moving to the suburbs, but this appears to show that it's not concentrated there. Is that a correct assessment of this?
Mr. Chair, Councilmember Munt. Poverty, there are areas of concentrated poverty in the suburbs. On the basis of the presentation slides, I suppose I would make a distinction between different suburbs, so that in places like Brooklyn Center, Brooklyn Park, New Hope, I believe Richfield, and maybe part of Bloomington too. Those are places with persistent areas of concentrated poverty since 2010, or more accurately, I guess, since the 2007 to 2011 period that we incorporated into this map. So there are those sets of ACP tracts. There are also other ACP tracts. For example, there I think one tract in Burnsville, up in I think as well one up in Forest Lake, where that have shown up in, and one in St. Louis Park too, I believe, that have shown up in one ACS data set. So those are places where poverty is relatively high, but just doesn't seem to have crossed that 40% threshold in a huge number of data sets. So I guess I would maybe provide some more nuance to the answer in that, yes, there is concentrated poverty in the suburbs, even though it seems to be more persistent in the central cities. But two broader points that your question brought to mind is that you can see from this chart that most people in poverty in the region actually don't live in an ACP. So that there are people in poverty living in every single community in our region. And so, yeah, it's important to keep that in mind when analyzing concentrated poverty.
I'd just like to, Councilmember Wolf, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Does the American Community Survey have data on how long people have lived in one place? You know, so you can sort of map the churn of people? Because it'd be nice to see sort of an intersection between how much people move and how well they're doing. Are they moving through these areas or stuck there, kind of a thing?
Yeah. Mr. Chair, Councilmember Wolf, the ACS does have data on how long people have lived in a given area. I believe that data at the local level, at the level of census tract, I don't think it's available for. I don't think it's available broken out by poverty status. So, for example, we couldn't look at how long people in poverty have lived in a given area. It is something that we've looked at for the broader region, and in that light, it's the growth in the region's population poverty has been more people who already live here becoming poor, although that data did come from the Great Recession. So because it brings together so many different things, it's hard to offer a clear answer on that. But we'll continue to look and see what other data resources might be available.
Councilmember Dorfman.
So I have a question. If when we look at the loss of naturally occurring affordable housing, so if you look at the sort of census tract, to what extent can the loss of those units actually impact these measures? So if you look at a big project like the Crossroads in Richfield, where there was a flip of 700 plus units from what was naturally occurring affordable housing to higher end housing, will then, and I don't know if that particular area where it sort of, that census tract, where it sort of falls in all of this, but in a sense, when you have a big project like that flip, it could potentially change the sort of characteristics in terms of whether it's an area of concentrated poverty, right?
Mr. Chair, Councilmember Dorfman, yes, to that specific, the specific tract that the former Crossroads Commons is in.
Yeah.
I don't recall whether that was ever an area of concentrated poverty.
Yeah.
There are other complexes around it that that have been sold on the basis of I believe, the late 2016 Minnesota Housing Partnership report. I think a lot of sales tend to be too recent, given the available data, to be able to say anything for sure on that. So, for example, this most recent data is from 2012 to 2016, and a lot of the sales that have attracted a lot of attention have taken place within that period. So I think that as those effects continue to play out, and as we get more and more newer years of ACS data, we may be able to pick up on that. But that is something that we tend to look at when we see large changes in tract poverty rates, whether there have been large changes to the rental market. So thank you.
And the reason this is really interesting. I think we need more time to digest this and talk with staff about what it means, and but it occurs to me that just on that little issue of NOAA, since we're seeing that a fair loss of NOAA housing, that, I mean, we think concentration of poverty is not a good thing, that we ought to healthier neighborhoods, have more diverse housing stock, and we want to give people more choices in high opportunity, higher income areas, and we want to bring more diversity into areas of poverty. And so if in fact, and I think this probably isn't true in that Richfield tract, but if we had a tract where a big project closed or flipped like that, we'd go, oh, this isn't an area of concentrated poverty anymore. And we would normally say, well, that's a good thing, but it's not a good thing. You know what I mean? So I'm trying to think about that.
Councilmember Mott?
Mr. Chair, I know it's outside the scope of the council's work, but I was just calculating what somebody who earned $15 an hour would earn. That would be $31,200. For a family of two, that would be 64,400, which would take them beyond the 185%. So it seems to me that part of our solution is supporting mayors like Mayor Carter, who wants to do $15 an hour within his city so that people who work hard don't have to live in poverty.
It seems to me there's a number of threads in the work plan that we just adopted that tie directly into this work. I mean, not just the connection between workforce development and affordable housing, but there's 6 or 7 sort of points of intersection. And I agree with Councilmember Dorfman's comment that I think it makes sense to try to bring this forward in some way. It just seems, I find it incredibly challenging to look at that map that's almost 85 years old and recognize the clear, and very persistent legacy of those sets of choices. One question I have, Matt, is you'd mentioned, a priority of how do we collaborate with other stakeholders? And one question I was sort of thinking about in my head is the census tract you mentioned in Columbia Heights, where there's a significant change in profile in that tract. Are there ways that we have to deliver that kind of, I think, really important research to local partners? And maybe they're already running the same kind of analytics and reaching the same conclusions, but I suspect some cities are in a stronger position to be conducting that kind of analysis than others. Is that a way that we can, add value, is by sharing that information, whether that's a census tract that's experiencing a higher rate of poverty, or maybe there's a shift to a lower rate of poverty. There are dynamics either way. Is there a threshold where we share that kind of information with local partners, not in a general way that might go through the communications kind of broader communication strategy, but more in a more targeted way with individual communities?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. One effort that comes to mind is the Neighborhood Change and Transition Index that the research unit has been working on, which was a collaboration between research and local planning assistance that was presented at the Minnesota Policy Conference last year. I was not very involved in that, so if someone else would like to approach and answer.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Matt. That's one piece where we're trying to take the research, this particular project, take the research and kind of at a regional scale and kind of classify community or neighborhoods that are like one another and have approaches and policy tools that can help address those particular issues that a particular neighborhood would face rather than kind of a one size fits all suburban toolbox, so to speak. We know that many of our like our two core cities, have spent a lot of time on focusing on gentrification and the ill effects of gentrification and trying to prevent that. But in our suburban communities, we're kind of seeing that opposite type change happening in their communities. So we've been working on that project and are kind of moving into that toolbox creation. There's a couple of other regions around the country that have done a similar regional look, including Chicago and one other I can't remember off the top of my head. One of the other elements that we do try to provide us through our sector reps and one-on-one conversations as well is kind of that more nuanced conversation about what they're seeing in their communities, what we're seeing from our research, and connecting local staff to resources that might help them in their planning efforts as they're working on their comprehensive plan updates, but also in implementing those plans in a more equitable manner that actually is inclusive, helps with on the development side, helps prevent displacement, and on the kind of investing in neighborhood side helps bring neighborhoods up, all neighborhoods up to having kind of that higher value, higher investment, trying to prevent the disinvestment that we often see in areas concentrated poverty. So really more of a kind of quiet, nuanced conversation when we have those opportunities.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Councilmember Dorfman.
Matt, you mentioned New Hope. Can you remind me what you said about New Hope?
Certainly, Mr. Chair, Councilmember Dorfman. New Hope is a suburb with what's one of those, I guess, what I call the persistent ACP that it had attract. See if I can highlight it with a mouse right here. So a tract that has had an area of concentrated poverty or a poverty rate above 40% in each of these 6 ACS data sets. It also happens to be an ACP 50 as well.
Because it's interesting. I mean, the city of New Hope has been doing lots of redevelopment with new housing projects and economic development. They also have a big, I think they have a relatively big percent of seniors. They probably have a fair amount of housing that's naturally occurring, affordable housing that's been around for a long time. And when they talk about the city, they're really proud of all their new housing development, some of which is affordable. And so it's interesting. And I don't know the characteristics of that particular census tract that you're talking about, but they certainly don't refer to a portion of town that is light with, concentration of poverty. And so, I mean, it would be interesting to know more, just like the Richfield or the other tract that you showed, more about, because concentrations of poverty in the suburbs look different than concentrations of poverty in the urban core, I think. And how this is just enough information that I get really excited and want to know it and know very little, but want to know more.
Well, let's have a follow-up. I think that's in order. Any other comments or questions? Matt, thank you very much.
Thank you all.
Really provocative information. Members, our last item in our information item is relating to a process that the council is engaged in with Metro Cities relating to Livable Communities Act programs. And I know Councilmembers Wolf, Barber, and Elkins are also involved in this work. Paul Burns and Charlie Vanderarty are here to present and give us an overview of the first meeting and kind of the way forward. Welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm Paul Burns, manager of the Livable Communities program, and as you just pointed out, you explained most of what I was going to say, other than to build on it by saying that we're often in communications with Metro Cities. Metro Cities is a critical partner of ours and has been throughout the history of this program. And so we're often in communications, and we've been over the last year in communications about revisiting, is the program accomplishing what it was set out to do, and is it serving the members of Metro Cities in the best possible way? And so Metro Cities this fall conducted a survey of its members to ask those questions. We got the results back and convened a group, again with Council Members Wolf, Dorfman, and Barber and Elkins, 10 members from Metro Cities, and during the first meeting, I gave an overview similar to the one I gave to this committee a couple of months ago, and we went around the room and heard many of the same themes that were reflected in the survey. A lot of very positive experiences, positive comments, but then there were also questions raised or concerns raised about the application process, the length of the review process. Are we doing an adequate outreach effort to communicate what the expectations are? And then the competitiveness of the program, particularly in how the scoring is applied. And so in the next couple of meetings, we hope to explore those issues in a little bit more depth than um, uh, identify if there's any areas that need improvement.
Great, thank you, Mr. Chair. Charlie Vanderarty for Metro Cities, and I'm pleased to receive an invitation to present today, so thank you very much. As Paul explained, Metro Cities has convened a work group to review the Livable Communities programs, and formation of the group was recommended by Metro Cities for the purposes of examining the programs and to identify areas of concern and any potential recommendations for modification to the programs. Metro Cities responded to a Met Council request last year to review 6 program areas that inform the 2017 fund distribution plan. And a group of city officials met twice and recommended modest changes that were incorporated into last year's plan. Following up on that work, we believe that it's time to take a broader review of the programs to ensure that they continue to meet statutory objectives as well as regional and local goals and to be accessible to participating communities. So we have actually 11 cities that are participating in the group, as are council members Wolf and Barbara and Elkin. So thank you for your participation in the group. Metro Cities strongly supports the Livable Communities programs, and which over their 20-year history have provided funding for a range of activities. Our policies support ensuring these programs continue to be operated using criteria that are flexible and support a range of appropriate objectives with user-friendly processes and accessibility. So cities across the region responded to a survey late last year, as Paul mentioned, and the survey found that there's city awareness of the Livable Communities program and timelines. Some cities are more aware than others, depending on their development in the cities. The survey also found that there was appreciation for the program. Cities find the program a helpful tool for funding common regional goals such as affordable housing development, tax-based revitalization, job creation. Several cities had recommended changes for the application process. Some critiqued it as too extensive or intimidating. Some had questions around the role and process of the Livable Communities Advisory Committee, the LCAC, and a need for more clarity on what the council expects from applicants. Additionally, some cities commented on the need for better information and examples of innovation and demonstration, and this is particularly relevant to the Livable Communities demonstration account. Additionally, there were several requests for less one-size-fits-all requirements and requesting more flexibility for outer ring communities. Based on the survey comments and discussion at the first meeting, this work group will review the funding accounts, review the council's current scoring criteria, and review how the council weighs the scoring criteria, and then the cities will share their perception of how the program meets local needs. So thank you for the invitation to participate today, and I'm happy to answer any questions you may have.
Yes,
Can
Councilman Dorfman.
So Charlie, I was just learning a little bit more about this today because I'd forgotten about it. But so there is a 4th account under Livable Communities, which is inclusionary housing. That used to be funded a while ago at like $10 million a year and hasn't been for a long time. Is Metro Cities supportive of adding that funding back in?
For under the LHIA account?
The inclusionary housing.
Inclusionary housing, which was the 4th account that I don't know how long it's been since it hasn't been funded.
It was only
but
funded once.
It was only funded once. But that was part of the original act.
As far as funding that, I mean, this work group, I think, is looking at what is currently funded in the scoring.
Yeah, and I'm really asking a Metro Cities question. Is
Okay.
Metro Cities supportive? Is that part of your legislative agenda at all moving forward?
It's not something in a budget year that we have put out as a legislative priority this year, but funding for housing programs, whether from the state and the Metropolitan Council, is something that we do support.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
Thank you to the members who are participating. I don't know if any of you want to make any comments about, the first meeting or your next steps.
Well, I will. I think the tone of the meeting was generally positive. There are a number of boosters of the program at the table. I say the biggest frustration was probably voiced by Sue Arntz, who's the city administrator in Laconia. And if you're an ex-urban growth center, and you've got greenfield development and don't really have much in the way, have no transit, and really don't have that serious a housing issue. There's just not a lot of places where you plug into the program. Yeah. That was the biggest frustration was voiced.
Councilmember Barber.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I will echo those comments. I think that I really liked the variety of cities that were represented around the table, because there were a number of cities that have had great success with LCA, some that have tried, like Waconia has tried several times. They're very interested in doing things, but haven't had the right projects match up. And so it was really good to hear sort of some of the themes, and I know that some of us in the outer districts here over and over of both wanting to participate, but also or the frustrations of how to engage and be successful in the process. So I think it's going to be a good dialogue, and I definitely kudos to kind of a nice representative group for a good discussion.
Councilmember Wolf.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We're on a very short timeline for a potentially very large subject, so I hope we can get as much done as we can in the time allotted. I look forward to hearing more about, more from cities who don't apply. Why not? You know, I mean, the people who have done well, of course, they like the program, but, you know, in terms of keeping the program is something that is broadly accessible across the region, finding out more from the cities that don't apply, why they don't apply, I think is the biggest learning piece that we need to dig into.
Yes.
So
Councilmember Dorfman.
that seems to get at the sort of most significant issue around livable communities, that on one hand we say we want it to be regionally balanced and we want it to work for other communities, but it really wasn't, the criteria wasn't really designed, the purpose of the original act wasn't really designed to do that. And even now, as we have some criteria around urban suburban balance, when the Livable Communities Committee ranks projects, we often, because of that criteria, have to skip over a higher ranked project to go to a lower one and so the more you sort of look at the criteria and expand that, we can get to something that's regionally balanced that might work for Waconia and others, but then you're really getting away from the purpose of livable communities to start with. So it's a challenge to have that balance.
It sounds like discussion about the statutory background is really it's on the agenda there. That's, I think, good. It's pretty clearly written.
Yeah,
Councilmember Elkins.
I had a chance to talk to Ted Mondale at our 50th anniversary celebration about the Livable Communities Act. He was kind of one of the lead authors. I said, what was the real impetus? And in his case, of course, he was representing St. Louis Park during that era when all of the ground pollution was coming to light, and they had this huge issue with how are they going to clean up and redevelop their city when there is so much pollution of the soil, which hence the origins of the PBRA part of the program. So it was very much originally thought of as kind of an urban suburban redevelopment support support program.
Other comments? I guess there are none. Thank you very much. Thanks for the opportunity. We'll look forward to the next steps and following along. Thank you. Members, that concludes our agenda.
We'll sign a letter at Emily's.
I think we'll be adjourned unless there's any new business. Okay, we're adjourned.